Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cook With Me Live. My goodness, tonight we're going to get a bit crazy in the kitchen, and to that effect I want to show you how to make my favorite form of energy bars. Now there's lots of different variations we can do on this, and I'm going to show you a few key tricks. I also want to bring up and show you, I guess, maybe some of the reasons why we don't want to be going for the more commercial varieties of our energy bars, our protein bars, etc. So while everyone's logging in, please just give me a little wave, give me a little hello, let me know where you're cooking from tonight. And then we're going to get stuck straight in. So tonight, I guess you could say, is a little bit more like a dessert rather than a main meal. However, because we're using whole foods, technically speaking, if you're in a pinch, you could maybe get away with a couple bars of these as a bit of a meal in a pinch. Not that I'm saying that needs to be dinner tonight. They're actually better when they're chilled, either in the fridge or the freezer. Okay, so before I get into, I guess, some of the more nitty-gritty detail on these things, I would like to get us at least cooking the quinoa and or amaranth first, so that that's going to be done in time for us to finish making the bars. So if you don't already have the quinoa or the amaranth or, whatever your choice of grain was soaked, then at this point, we're just going to be giving them a good rinse and then getting them into the pot to start cooking. So I've given you in your recipe, depending on how much you've decided to make, I've also recommended you might want to make a double batch in case then you're going to the amount of effort anyways. You'll have some extras for leftover in a different use tomorrow. Now I've soaked the exact amount that I need for this recipe. And basically what I'm going to do now is we're going to get that drained, and then we're going to get that straight away onto the stovetop. So that's going to cook while we get all the other ingredients ready. Okay, so if you haven't already got those out, ready to go, here we are. Like I said, nothing crazy. I've just had this soaking since this morning. And if you've soaked it with the amaranth, so amaranth is the really tiny grain, and quinoa, believe it or not, is the slightly bigger one. So that's quinoa and that's amaranth. And if once you've soaked them, then you should be able to put them through a fine sieve or a fine strainer like this without having the amaranth kind of slip through the holes. Okay, so that's just a little trick, a little tip, is if you've had it pre-soaked, then you can get away with straining it like this. If you haven't soaked it, then you might actually need to strain out the amaranth in either a nut milk bag or potentially in maybe to not even, like if you don't have a fine sieve like this, you might not even necessarily be able to strain the amaranth because it's quite a small little grain. Okay, and then back into the pot once that's drained. Let's try and get all of that in there. There we go. And if you're just logging in now, please give me a little hello, a little hurrah, and let me know if you're cooking with me tonight or if you're just having a little watch so you can cook this at another time. Always curious to find out. And please, guys, you know that this is the time for questions. So any substitution questions you want to find out, any particular bits of information you want to know, this is why we do this in this form, so you have time to ask those questions. Okay, now because I've used the exact amount and because I have pre-soaked them, I'm going to be needing 2/3 of a cup of water. So let's get that into there now. It's not going to seem like a lot. So that's 1/3 and 2/3. And by now it's already soaked up a lot of the liquid that it's going to need. Okay, this is what I call the absorption method. And that's something I go into a lot more detail in my course on how to do that in full depth and in detail for all the different grains. But basically you've got all the instructions you need for this one in the recipe. And now from this point, because we have the exact right amount of water in to create the right texture that we're after, all we have to do is get this onto the boil, and as soon as it starts boiling, then we're going to drop it down to the lowest setting temperature and let it sit for about 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm actually going to put that on a bit of a bigger burner, get that up to heat straight away, and then as soon as that starts to boil, I'm going to turn it back down, right down to 1, and let that finish cooking while we get the rest of the ingredients ready. That's easy, right? So easy. Now, for those of you that have never tasted amaranth before, or never even heard of the word, or maybe didn't even know how to say it, I just wanted to introduce that to you because it's another kind of one of the good grains. It's another form of a gluten-free grain that is similar to the quinoa in a sense. It's grown in a similar fashion, but it's a very tiny one, and it's really high in protein, it's really good in minerals, and it's got a whole bunch of other benefits for the body. So again, when it comes down to getting more variety in your diet, that's what I'm after, is introducing you to some new foods potentially that can improve the variety of your diet. Now, the texture and consistency of amaranth is a lot stickier than, say, for example, a quinoa or a rice. So that's generally why I combine it in with either quinoa or rice when I'm cooking it. Otherwise, it can be a little bit gluggy on its own. So for most people that like to be able to have that individual texture with the grains that you eat, in this case, amaranth is going to make it a little bit stickier, but it's perfect for what we're after in the sake of these bars, these energy bars. Okay, how's everyone going? Let's see who we've got online here and if you guys have any questions. Hello, Reardon. Thank you for being online. Gina, welcome. Thank you. Robin, great to see you. Awesome. You guys are really hooking in. That's great. And Glenda, welcome. Thank you very much for being online. Glenda, you're cooking with me. Yes. And Robin, yes. And you're with Fraser and Isla. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Okay, so if everyone's caught up with me now, we've got the quinoa and or amaranth on the boil. We're going to listen for when that starts to boil. And in the meantime, first of all, before we get into measuring out all of our ingredients, I want to talk about why I've created this recipe and why I've called it Crazy Bars. Now, first step is coming back to practicing your label reading. So when it comes to the sort of quick and easy grabs, such as our muesli bars, our energy bars, our high protein bars, or maybe we're choosing the low carb bars, it doesn't really matter what the brand is or what it looks like. We've got to be reading labels. And generally what you're going to find are a whole bunch of additives and non-whole foods. Now, why does that matter? Well, let's just take this one, for example. So I'm guessing this marketing is aimed at the males and it's aimed at building some big muscles. So therefore, you need to have more protein, right? I'm not going to get into all the details on protein. It's a huge talk that I could practically talk on for 2 days. And that's something actually that we cover in great detail in the course. So in the meantime, have a look at the ingredients that are hiding in this bar. When I say hiding, only because most people are not yet in the habit of actually flipping it over and having a look. So if you can see there, you've maybe not known that you're eating multiple different kinds of dairy. There's going to be potentially to use some hidden forms of artificial flavors. There's also some flavor enhancers that are going to be formed as a result of some of the ingredients in that list. And this is again where you kind of need to Google, because now there's over 30 different names that flavor enhancers hide under. Okay, so we've got isolates in here. We've got highly processed hydrolyzed components in here. We've got, like I said, multiple different forms of dairy that maybe people wouldn't realize. Potentially some of these ingredients are genetically modified. Personally, I don't really want to be an experiment for that or not, and I'd rather know if I'm eating genetically modified foods. In this case, we also have an artificial sweetener. They're adding salt, and in this case, it's not going to be the good salt. It'll be, dare I say, the cheap salt, because that's the smarter move for a food manufacturer. We've got emulsifiers, we've got flavors, we've got other forms of sugar alcohols, we've got, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully the point is somewhat made that what you think you might be getting might not be so beneficial in the eyes of the body. Now, without getting into too much more detail on that, it's not too much of a different story for these other forms of bars. It's just going to be different forms of additives that you're getting, maybe potentially higher forms of sugar, different forms of flavors, different concentrates, different gelling agents, different emulsifiers, different natural flavors, different hydrogenated palm kernel oils, etc., etc. So think about your body and how it loves food. Does it recognize those types of ingredients that are highly processed, maybe even made in a lab? So for example, this one is maybe seen to be one of the more healthy options on the shelf. And, if you have a look at the ingredients, yes, some of the ingredients are organic. That's great. The first ingredient is organic rice syrup. And then we've got some more sugars later on down the ingredient list. We've also got some gluten in there, and we've also got a whole bunch of added vitamins. So these are vitamins that are extracts. They are isolates, okay? Now, again, probably, arguably, maybe a bit better than some of the other varieties. But again, just having a think about, in terms of a comparison, not only on cost, but also on value to the body, ease of preparation, it's just a lot easier for your body to extract the nutrients that it needs in the balance that nature has sent it to us in the form of whole foods. So that is probably my main motivation for getting a recipe or multiple recipes to you. So you have options up your sleeve for making your own energy bars, protein bars, whatever you want to call it. These bars are full of it all because we're using the whole foods. So we've got the extra high protein coming from the quinoa, coming from the amaranth, coming from the nut butters. We've got the extra vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, the you name it, coming from the whole foods, such as our cacao nibs. Okay, so the cacao nibs are mostly the antioxidant content. The hemp seeds, if you're using them, are mostly the omega-3 essential fatty acids. We've got chia seeds in there, which are very beneficial for minerals, for different vitamins. Are you getting my drift? Okay, so these are superfoods, and we have to see them with as much light and as much power to heal our bodies and to feed our bodies and to nourish our bodies, rather than relying on so-called isolates or things that are, extracted from their original form and processed. Okay, so let's get making our crazy bars. If your quinoa is already boiling, let's turn that down to the lowest setting. I think I can hear mine going crazy, yes. So we'll turn that down to the lowest setting, and do not lift the lid if you can, because all that steam now is going to help absorb into the quinoa and keep that pressure up in the cooking process. So don't be tempted to lift the lid and stir it. Doesn't need it. Lowest temperature, and sit it and forget about it. Okay, let's get into it. How are we going? Hello, Angela. Welcome. Just watching. Hello, Charlotte and Jasmine. Thank you for being on with Mum as well. Okay, the other reason I've called them crazy bars is not because it makes you crazy, but because they're crazy good for you. Now, I've touched on that from the whole food aspect. The next thing I want to talk about are superfoods and superfood supplements that people are starting to use, starting to become really kind of hyped up about, and I just want to bring that to light. So I have a couple of options here. This is definitely not our only options. The key, if you're going to be having a supplement in any form like this, the key would be to find one that's made from whole foods, predominantly, all right? So as an example, there are multiple greens powders on the market, but what maybe some people don't know about the greens powders, so for example, this one has, it has chlorella powder, it has spirulina, it has wheatgrass juice, it has barley grass juice powder, it has nettle, horsetail, and that's it. Okay, so as far as a greens powder goes, what most people don't realize is that the cheaper greens powders tend to be dried grass that has been pulverized into a powder versus some of the more expensive ones, and you have to make sure that this is the case with them. They juice the greens first and then dehydrate the powder. So the big difference there is that our bodies are not necessarily designed like a cow that has 4 stomachs to digest grass. So some of the cheaper greens powders that you get could be potentially causing some digestive difficulty or some digestive upset in you, potentially. And the better quality ones are not sending through those indigestible fibers from the grasses, they're just sending through the beneficial nutrients that come out in the juice form. Okay, that's just a little tip when you're looking at greens powders. When you're looking at kind of a more overall trying to be everything supplement food, something that is mostly whole food based is going to be great. Now, I've reviewed a ton of them. This one seems to be one of the better ones that I've found, and look, I'm probably potentially missing a new one on the market or some other one on the market, but just have a little squiz at those ingredients. Okay, so you can see that yes, now there are maybe a couple ingredients on there that I'm not super happy about, namely the pineapple flavor. But instead of pointing exactly at that, I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And instead I'm going to, look at this ingredient list and go, okay, if I am going to choose a whole food powder, and these are my different choices, then am I happier with this one because it's using organic flaxseed, organic chlorella, organic wheat juice. It's adding barley leaf, papaya, broccoli sprout, vanilla, rosehip, globe artichoke, shiitake mushroom, etc. Okay, so it's adding the whole foods in the components, as in the balance that nature intended it, just in dried pulverized form. So if you could ever choose a supplement, try to choose one that relies mostly on whole foods instead of one that relies mostly in a lab, okay? And basically that's if you decide, like me, and you don't have to agree, that I want to put my trust in nature's design and a little bit less so in some of science's, I guess you could say, chemical lab design to get it bang on. There's a lot that science readily admits that it doesn't fully understand about a lot of foods too, and how they work and how they're beneficial in the body. But again, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to do your own research and to ultimately test on your own body and see how you feel. Okay, so regardless of whether or not you're going to use a supplement powder in this recipe or not, that's completely okay, completely up to you. The sense of these being crazy bars is also because there's a crazy amount of different substitutions you can use, and you can fully customize this recipe, so long as you kind of keep the approximate texture of the ingredient that you're substituting. I'll give you an example. Instead of using quinoa and amaranth, basically what we're getting from the quinoa and amaranth is kind of that sticky, the bulk of the recipe, right? So instead, you could be using some cooked brown rice. You could be using some buckwheat. Maybe instead, you could get a little bit creative. Now this is pushing the friendship potentially. We could maybe go for some roasted sweet potato. I don't know, we should try it. Okay, so the idea here is that we want bulk and we want a little bit of the sticky factor so that by the time we freeze it or put it in the fridge, it's all gonna hold together and it's gonna taste amazing. So that's one example of a substitution. The next one is that I get a lot of requests for school lunch boxes, and a lot of schools are not allowing nuts of any form in any food. So if you aren't gonna put the almond butter in this, for example, what could you use instead? If you've already had a little read in the notes already, you can see that I've said you can use sunflower butter instead. Now, it just so happens that I don't have any almond butter, so I am going to be using some sunflower butter, okay, some organic sunflower butter. And instead of the tahini, which I also happen to be out of, fancy that, lots of substitution opportunities, I'm going to be putting in a little bit of peanut butter because I don't need to worry about these being nut-free, okay? So there's a lot of opportunities to substitute. If you're out of something, for example, I'm out of the hemp seeds today as well. So what can we substitute instead of hemp seeds? Have a little think. Could you put more chia seeds in, more flax meal in instead? Definitely. Could you put more cacao nibs? Yes. Could you maybe chuck in some actual sunflower seeds or some pepitas? There's a lot of benefit in pepitas, guys. They're really high in zinc, and anyways, I could go on and on. But the point here is that it's really flexible, it's really easy for lunch boxes, and it tastes just as good straight out of the freezer as it does by the time it thaws out in their lunchbox for either morning tea, lunch, or afternoon tea snack. Okay, let's get into it. You're going to need a food processor. And to prevent your food processor from kind of struggling too much, we're going to start off and do this in 2 stages. So the first stage is to add all of the dry ingredients first. All right, and other than that, it's going to be fairly simple. So let's start off with, if you're using it, 5 tablespoons of your superfood powder. Now I'm sure you can imagine that that's going to give you a lot of nutrition, a lot of benefit per bar by the time we make the whole batch. Okay, and again, if you're not so sure whether or not you're going to like the taste of it, or you've had a taste of your chosen superfood powder and you go, not so sure, just put less in, and then you'll know, at least you won't ruin your batch. This one I've found I can get away with about 5 tablespoons. And it does tweak the flavor a little bit, because like I said, they have kind of put those flavors in, which if this company is listening, you can do without. But I'm going to put the 5 tablespoons of this powder in. Actually, no, I'm going to add another tablespoon of this one, because this is one of my favorites. And look how dark and rich that guy is. That's awesome. That's the chlorella in there. Okay. So we've got our tablespoons of our superfood powder. Is everyone caught up to us? Oh, and hello to Angus. Thank you for letting me know. Glad you're watching as well. Maybe you get to eat some superfood bars tonight. Don't know if you guys are making it. Now, about 1/2 cup of cacao. What is cacao good for? Anyone know? I'll give you a clue. It's really high in something that starts with A and ends in oxidants, antioxidants, that is. Okay, so cacao powder is really good for antioxidants. It's also it does have a little bit of caffeine in it, okay? So you can watch that if you're trying to cut out or cut down the caffeine content. You can reduce the amount of cacao. But basically, this is kind of the original and the starting point of making chocolate before we add all the sugar and potentially any of the milk solids. Okay, so it does have a lot of benefit. It also is said to have high levels of magnesium in it, so which can be seen as sometimes a good relaxer. Let's add some coconut. Now, if you're using a food processor and you don't have the desiccated coconut, that's all right. If you've got flaked coconut or even shredded coconut, that's absolutely fine. So this is my little half cup scoop. To get 2 cups of that, I'm going to need 4 of those. So coconut is one of our main ingredients. There we go. And if you've never made any form of bar before, or, you know, this is similar to a bliss ball, but I think the texture and the way that it comes out when we're done with it is a lot more similar to a bar texture, and it's very much more similar to your conventional store-bought bars as well. All right, after the coconut, we've got about 2 tablespoons of chia seeds. Now again, if you're substituting any of those other ingredients out, just maybe you have to make up for that with a little bit of extra of the other stuff, and I'm going to be doing that. So I'm actually going to put in 3 tablespoons of chia seeds. Nature's little bundle of awesomeness those are. And for those of you that have kids, and if you've never taken some chia seeds and mixed it in water, you can use about 5 times as much water as you did chia seeds, and you can see it form this really awesome gel. Okay, and it's just cool for kids to be able to see that and to the idea of playing with food, I think. And then you can turn that gel, instead of using water, you can use other things like orange juice or coconut cream and turn it into like a chocolate pudding. All right, these are my cacao nibs. Now, this is the form of the cacao bean that has been fermented and then dried and then just crushed. So the cacao that we just put in has come from this cacao nib. And the only other thing that's in there as well is then going to be the cacao butter, or the fat component from the cacao bean. So this still has the cacao butter in with the cacao powder. And when they separate those two, we get cacao, and then we get the separate cacao butter. That word sounds funny now that I've said it so many times. You're probably hearing it funny too. So we'll put some of those in. It's a really good amount of crunch. On their own, they're maybe bitter for someone that has a sweet tooth, but the more you kind of get used to them, they provide that really nice crunch inside this recipe that I love. Okay, like I said, I'm not including the hemp seeds, so I'm going to add a little bit of extra flax meal as I did the extra chia seeds. I just happen to be out of the hemp seeds, otherwise I definitely would have that in there. Okay, so I'm going to go about 4 tablespoons of the flax meal. Now, why are we putting flax meal in? Kids have any ideas? You might not get a chance to type it by the time I give you the answer, but you can pause it if you need to. Flax meal, it's really high in beneficial fiber, which is really good for effective elimination, keeping you regular, and it's also really high in omega-3 essential fatty acids, which are really good for your brain. So this is contributing to some of the other ingredients we've used as brain foods, which is why it's a great lunchbox snack for adults or kids. So definitely don't go without the flax meal. It also is going to act as a bit of a binder in there. So once it becomes kind of moistened, it's going to start becoming a bit sticky, and that's a good thing for these bars. Now the salt, you could say if you're using a good quality salt, as in a Himalayan or a Celtic, then to this effect we are adding electrolytes in the perfect ratio that nature intended them. Okay, so never when I say salt am I talking about table salt. I'm always talking about Celtic or Himalayan salt, being the healthier version. And that's pretty much all of our dry ingredients. So at this point, we're going to get that blended up just to ease one step before we put in all the sticky stuff. So let's just give that a really good blitz. Say maybe speed 7. For about 3 seconds. That's all it really needs. We don't really need to crush anything at this point. We just want an even mix. There we go. Whew. Powdery. Okay, so let's start adding the wet ingredients in preparation for our quinoa being done cooking. Okay, we need to add the honey, obviously the quinoa is happening, and our 2 different choices of our sticky butters. As you can see, it's a pretty easy recipe. All right, but again, every time you make it, you could potentially be making it different based on the different substitutions that you try after the other. One other version of this recipe that I tried had, instead of putting the cacao powder and going for more of that chocolatey flavor, I went for more of a ginger vanilla. So I put in some crystallized ginger pieces, chopped up nice and fine, and I put in obviously some vanilla powder, and I believe I also had some ginger spice and maybe a little bit of cinnamon in there too. and that was quite a yummy one. Personally, I guess my favorite has always been to the cacao side, but definitely if you are particularly avoiding caffeine for any reason, then you can try other flavors and other varieties. Okay, so we need about 1/3 of a cup of honey. Now, ideally, you are using a raw honey. This is not the default. So the cheaper honeys on the market are going to be pasteurized. And the reason for raw is because there are heat-sensitive components of honey that are the really beneficial ones for our body. So as soon as we pasteurize it, as soon as we heat that up, we are ruining a lot of the benefits of the honey. Okay? And especially in this case, because we're not cooking the honey, we really want to get the most value out of that, the most benefit. Again, a lot of which science has readily admitted they don't fully understand yet. Okay? So for those of you that are strictly avoiding honey for whichever reason, you could definitely be substituting some organic rice malt syrup. Okay, that's an option. You might need to add a little bit more because it's not as sweet as honey. Or you could be adding maybe a bit of maple syrup, but please try to make sure it's real maple syrup and not maple flavored syrup, which actually has no maple syrup in it. All right, so we've got a little bit of honey. Let's put in the butters. So I've called for 1/2 cup of one and 3 tablespoons of the other. Now, because I'm making substitutions, I'm just going to go 1/2 of each. So 3 tablespoons is approximately 1/4 cup. So I've got a total of 3/4 cup. So I'm going to go 1/2 and 1/2 of that, a little bit more than 1/3 cup each. Not to confuse anyone, but I just want to go 1/2 of these two. Okay, so any nut butter, guys, will work, or any seed butter. And depending on how splurgy you want to go, you should try this recipe with macadamia butter. Oh my goodness, that is divine. With a little bit of vanilla, a bit of cinnamon. Oh, so good. Macadamia crazy bars. At that point, you might not even want to change the flavor with a superfood. You might just want to keep them macadamia butter, quinoa, and the other superfoods that we're putting in there. Okay, that's approximately what we need. Doesn't have to be exact, guys. Okay. And now for our sunflower butter. Who had never heard of sunflower butter before? You can be honest, it's all right. I didn't really try any till recently either, but it's a great option, especially if you're needing to avoid nuts in a school environment. Okay, otherwise tahini, tahini is my favorite, hence why I'm out of it, and I buy it by the 2-kilo tub. Just haven't ordered enough in time. So yeah, tahini is probably my favorite. I love the flavor, but I also love that it's got that extra high content of calcium. But it's good to have variety in your diet too. So being that I was out of tahini meant that I used the sunflower butter, which is a good thing, because more variety equals a better chance of you getting what your body might otherwise be lacking. There we go. Okay, we are nearly done. Now I wonder if it's been approximately 15 minutes and whether or not our quinoa is going to be ready to go. Let's test it. So in the event that it's not done, I'm doing something bad and lifting the lid. Now, if you'd have been proper and set the timer, you wouldn't have had to do this. Let's see. So we're looking for not having any liquid left down the bottom. And I think we're in luck. There we go. So there's no liquid left to be absorbed. Therefore, we are cooked. Awesome. Okay. Now, in an ideal world, we would let this chill down a little bit before we mix it. But the advantage of putting it in hot is that it's actually going to mix a little bit easier, so that by the time we spread it into the dish, it's going to be that much softer and that much easier to spread. Okay, so just as a reminder, the only reason I'm putting it in this hot is for the sake of time tonight. Ideally, you can let this kind of fan out. You might even want to put it on a plate, spread it out, and just give it a little bit of time to cool off a little bit before you put it in. Okay, if you've never tasted quinoa and amaranth before on its own, save a little bite and have a little bite so that you know what it's like. Maybe you're going to want to have it as a side dish or in another dish, in a salad even. Lots of different ways you can have this. And if you've got leftovers, then it's really good to heat up. You can put it in soups. You can sometimes even sneak it into smoothies if it needs to get used up. Okay, so I've called for the 2.5 cups. I could measure it, but I'm pretty sure we got that accurate from the beginning based on how much we started with. So Let's just see what we get here. That's 1. That's 1 cup. Okay. There we go. And yes, we're going to have about 2.5 cups. Excellent. Okay, let's scoop the rest of that in. No waste. I hope everyone's using their nice spatula, preventing waste. There we go. Okay, done. That's the last ingredient. Now we need to blend away. So at this point, if you are using, well, whichever machine you're using, we want to crank it up straight away to a high speed so it has a more chance of kind of getting everything tossed in the beginning. If we go too slowly, then it's just going to bog the machine down. So we kind of want to blitz it really quickly. So I'm just going to jump it straight up to 10, and I'm just going to let it go until you can hear the motor really kind of start to churn. And at the very worst, at the end, we might have to do a bit of manual stirring, but that's okay. So crank it right up. Let's give it a bit of help. All right, and that should be good. And then we're going to need a container to put it in. Now, I would recommend using a little bit of baking paper in your container so that once it's partially frozen, you can lift the baking paper out of the container, and it makes it a lot easier to cut it up before it's fully frozen. Okay, so whatever container you want to be using, let's get that out now. Generally speaking, we want something about this size. Okay. So approximately. Now, it doesn't matter if it's bigger or smaller, you're just going to end up with a thicker or thinner bar. So absolutely okay if you've got different sized containers. And then a little bit of baking paper in there, just so it's easier to take out. There we go. Now, let's say that your family ends up loving your version of this recipe. Wouldn't it make sense to make a double batch and get it all in the freezer at once? You've made the mess once. You know, your food processor is already dirty. Wouldn't be much to now put another second batch in there. As we were measuring everything out, we would have measured another lot into another container so that when this one was empty, we dump everything in one, good to go, blend it up. Okay, so as you can see, it doesn't take a lot of extra time to do a second batch versus doing this all again another day. Okay? So anything that you find your family loves and you find yourself going back to and having to make more and more often, or there's high request and pretty pleases to do so, then it makes sense to kind of make a double batch, because this can live in the freezer for months, right? It's always there then. It's better than grabbing some of the other options in a pinch. Okay. Now, at this point, it's probably easiest if you do the spreading with the back of a spoon rather than a spatula. It's going to be a better angle. Okay, so straight into the corners first of all. This is exactly the texture we're after. All right, so by the time we press this down flat, it's going to hold, it's going to stick. And at this point, well, actually there's lots you can do with it. You could now sprinkle some nuts on top, or you know, you could get those pieces of crystallized ginger, cut them up and press them into the top here. Once it's cut into bars, you know, if you're feeling a little bit extra decadent, or if you're trying to get young kids off of a favorite bar of theirs that's maybe not so healthy, but like even for example, the one that I pointed to earlier that was dipped in yogurt, maybe instead for the first couple times you do this, you could then dip these bars into melted chocolate, half of the bar, and make it just like the ones in the shops, until we kind of get used to the fact that these ones are okay too, and I'm open to eating those, Mom, and obviously they're going to be feeling better as a result. Okay, there we have it. Don't need to do any more effort than that. We've packed it down, we've pressed it. That's going to be all the compaction we need to do. The rest of the magic is going to happen just by sitting and by being in the freezer. You can, it's just getting a little bit picky now, but if you want perfect bars, take that edge of the baking paper, fold it in fairly tight, and then press down on that edge. So it's just going to make a nice little edge if you're going to make perfect bars. Not absolutely critical in any way. Okay, so that's going to go now in the freezer for, say, 1 to 2 hours if you can. It can be fully frozen. It's just a lot easier to cut if you can take it out before it kind of hits that fully frozen mark. And then, here's what you get. Now I've already cut them up, but this is all I do, is I cut them up, I put them into a container. These have had a chance to kind of thaw out a little bit, but that's it. That's kind of the texture. So they do hold together nice as a bar, and that's an amazing energy bar. Hopefully you love the flavor. If you don't happen to love the flavor, maybe change the superfood that you've chosen, because that's probably going to be the most flavor influencing ingredient out of what we've put in there. And definitely, if you really don't like this version, try at least one more time and change what you think the main ingredient flavor that you're not happy with is. Because at the end of the day, if we can be getting these types of whole food based nutrition into your body instead of some of those other options, not only are you going to be saving money, but your body's probably going to be really thanking you for this option and this change. Okay, how's everyone going? Any other comments, any other questions before I leave you to your craziness? And I'd love to hear your feedback as well. It's maybe not exactly noticeable, hands down, but maybe in any way if your kids become less crazy when they come home from school after having a good base load of nutrition, rather than, if you're trying to reduce those packaged foods in their lunch boxes and you're starting to notice improvements, it's always good to share that with others so that they know that what's possible too. All right, well, thank you everyone for another episode of Cook With Me Live. And if there are no further questions, then I will leave you to your evening of craziness and wish you the best in all of your bar making, experiments, trials, tribulations, and hopefully a lot of fun. Thank you everyone, and we'll see you again soon on Cook With Me Live.